Thank you.
No, I'm not Niall Feguson, but nonetheless, thank you for the applause. Last time I received applause was when I announced to the people of Brown I was leaving. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome all of you to the first installment of the 2006-2007 Chancellor's Lecture Series. This series brings to our campus provocative and creative women and men who influence our thinking through the risks they take in their life and work. We invite such accomplished and interesting speakers to Vanderbilt in order that their knowledge and insight may integrate with that of our students, our staff, our faculty, and of course with the community that surrounds us, Nashville. This evening we welcome as Chancellor's Lecturer Niall Feguson, historian of the global economy, Tisch Professor of History at Harvard University, Professor of International History at the Harvard Business School, Faculty Associate at Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, and resident faculty member of the Minda de Gunzburg Center for European Studies. He is a senior research fellow at Oxford University as well as a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institute. Beyond his noteworthy academic profile, Niall Feguson is a public intellectual. His commentary on contemporary economics and politics, on ethnicity and empire, is published and broadcast on both sides of the Atlantic in the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine, in Foreign Affairs and the New York Review of Books. He writes columns on a regular basis for the Los Angeles Times and the Sunday Telegraph. Niall Feguson has published such internationally acclaimed works as The Pity of War, explaining World War I, The Cash Nexus, Money and Power in the Modern World, Empire, The Rise and Demise of the British World Order and Lessons for Global Power, and The World's Banker, The History of the House of Rothschild. Professor Feguson explores with ambition themes that are not only relevant to the past, but also of great urgency to the present. The relationship between politics and finance and the experience of empire, not only of the British imperial era, but also of the strengths and limitations of American global power. His recent book, Colossus, The Price of America's Empire, draws attention to the resemblances of the contemporary United States to the Roman Empire and to Victorian Britain. Professor Ferguson's most recent book, The War of the World, 20th Century Conflict and the Descent of the West, will make its debut in the U.S. in 2 weeks and is currently being produced as a television series by Britain's respected Channel 4. In The War of the World, Professor Feguson examines why the 20th century eventually proved to be the most violent, frightening, brutal, and brutalized century in history, with fanatical, often genocidal warfare managing to engulf most of the world's societies between the outbreak of World War I and the end of the Cold War. And he shows how we allowed the century to go so awfully, dreadfully wrong. In 2004, Time magazine named Niall Feguson one of the world's 100 most influential people. I am edified and reassured to know that we have people of influence who would prefer to avoid repeating the mistakes of history. This evening's lecture is about the War of the World. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Niall Feguson.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Chancellor Guy, for that flattering introduction. It's a huge honor and a privilege to be here to give one of the Chancellor's lectures. I understand I follow in distinguished footsteps. It's an appropriate venue to talk about the problem that I'm going to discuss tonight, the fundamental problem of human conflict. Why? Because this institution, as I found out only this afternoon, was in many ways established to help heal the wounds of a terrible civil war. And part of what I want to talk about this evening is what might be called the global civil war that tore the 20th century apart. And I want to ask a question, which is whether or not that catastrophe could repeat itself in our time. Can we in any way learn from the past? I'm going to show you some pictures mainly in order to keep you from slumbering in this rather darkened hall. I've discovered in the space of 4 years of teaching in the United States that a certain amount of visual pyrotechnics can help. But I want to stress that PowerPoint is really something of a disposable extra. In some ways, it's perfectly possible for you to shut your eyes and listen to what I have to say. You won't miss terribly much. Let me begin by answering a very simple question. Why is the title of my book, The War of the World, singular? Have I been guilty of plagiarism? Is this a very crude way of distinguishing my book from Steven Spielberg's recently successful movie, The War of the Worlds, starring that new father, Tommy Cruise? Well, no, actually, I had the idea before the movie was released, and I was inspired more by H.G. Wells than by Tom Cruise. I don't know if any of you have read the original novel, The War of the Worlds, but in many ways, it's a remarkably prescient work. Yes, it's a work of science fiction. Yes, it imagines a world invaded by Martians. And yet I want to suggest to you that in many ways, what Wells was doing back in 1898 was perhaps unconsciously visualizing what would be the signature act of violence of the 20th century, namely the destruction of a major city. The War of the World, singular, is an intended play on Wells's title. Because what I want to try to suggest is that what Wells imagined happening as a result of interplanetary war, as a result of an alien invasion from outer space, in fact happened again and again without the need for alien intervention. We did it to ourselves. In other words, Wells's nightmare came true, but it came true without the need for Martians. Here's a quotation from Wells's book, which I think perfectly illustrates the point I'm making. It describes scenes in London. It's not set in the United States. It's set in England, the original novel, but the dictates of Hollywood required it to relocate. I don't think Tom Cruise does an English accent, so it's probably just as well. The houses caved in as they dissolved at its touch and darted out flames. The trees changed to fire with a roar. This is the effect of the Martian's death ray, which obliterates everything in its path, including human beings. So wrote Wells, you understand the roaring wave of fear that swept through the greatest city in the world just as Monday was dawning. The stream of flight rising swiftly to a torrent, lashing in a foaming tumult around the railway stations. Did they dream they might exterminate us? The book captures in a most extraordinary way the sense of pandemonium that grips London as the alien invaders strike using weaponry undreamt of by late 19th century science. And yet, as I recently reread it, I couldn't help feeling that it wasn't science fiction at all. That what Wells was visualizing happened again and again in the century after he wrote. It happened in Louvain in 1914. It happened in Smyrna, present-day Izmir, in Turkey in 1922. It happened in Guernica in Spain during the Spanish Civil War in 1937. It happened to Warsaw when the Germans invaded Poland in 1939. It happened in London in 1941 when the Luftwaffe bombed the capital. It happened to Dresden in 1945 when the British and American air forces devastated that beautiful city. It happened, of course, in Hiroshima in 1945. And don't forget that it didn't stop then. It happened again in Seoul during the Korean War. In other words, Wells's vision of a city torn apart, thrown into chaos by an alien invasion, was realized without any need for Martians to play that part. Human beings did it to one another. And so the War of the World is about why that happened. Why, to put it very simply, it was men who became the alien invaders. And you'll see in these three posters from the Second World War the extent to which we were able to imagine the enemy as aliens, both sides. The one to the right is particularly interesting. It's actually a poster that was produced in Nazi-occupied Holland, and the symbolic figure is supposed to represent the United States as a hideous alien creature devastating Western Europe. It's a poster that fascinates me because of the way in which it grotesquely caricatures the United States, illustrating the way in which the Nazis understood their enemy and created an alien image of their enemy. But the interesting thing about the 20th century is that it cuts both ways. Not only did men behave like aliens, devastating cities, on both sides, notice, of the great conflict we call World War II. At the same time, we defined other human beings as aliens in a very different sense, as inferior beings, to use a German term, as Untermenschen, subhumans, as if they were members, literally, of another species. And these three posters, the one in the middle is probably the most familiar and absolutely classic Nazi anti-Semitic poster for the film The Eternal Jew, Der ewige Jude. The others may be less familiar to you. One is a poster from the Russian Civil War produced by the white anti-revolutionary or counter-revolutionary forces depicting Leon Trotsky in, again, strikingly anti-Semitic imagery. And then on the right, you have an extraordinary caricature of a Japanese man produced in the United States during World War II. This ability that human beings have, or certainly during the 20th century had, to represent one another as aliens is at the very heart of the story I want to tell you. Now, at one level, the War of the World asks a very simple central question. It's a deceptively simple question. Why was the 20th century the most violent century in all of history? That's an interesting question because in so many ways it ought not to have been so. My question is a huge paradox because when you come to think of it, the 20th century was quite exceptional in human history in terms of the material and scientific progress achieved in the 100 years after 1900. If you just do a rough calculation of what the average human being had to live on in cash terms, if you work out per capita global domestic product, you find that uniquely in history it increased by a factor of roughly 6 in the century that I'm talking about. If you look at life expectancy in Western societies, in the space of 100 years, it improved on average from 48, from less than 50, to 76. That's quite unparalleled in human history. Most of human history had not witnessed anything like this kind of material progress. And so I could go on. Improvements in political terms. At the beginning of the 20th century, only a minority of human beings lived in democracies. By the end, certainly by the mid-1990s, for the first time, a majority did. By all kinds of measures, by the amount of leisure time that people had, by the quality and quantity of food that they could consume. The 20th century was an age of spectacular progress. And yet, it was also, by absolute and also by relative measures, the most violent of all centuries, certainly of all centuries in modern history. You can argue about how violent the world was in the time of Chinggis Khan, or Genghis Khan as he's sometimes known in the 13th century. And there are some estimates that suggest the death toll of Chinggis Khan's wars was catastrophically high in relation to world population. And you can go back even further to prehistoric times and say that the death tolls in prehistoric societies due to violence were phenomenally high in relative terms. But let's focus on modern history. In modern history, the 20th century really stands out in the most extraordinary way. Let me illustrate in one way what I mean. If you take the number of people killed in battle, that's to say, exclude civilian populations from the calculation, and look purely at battlefield deaths, and then relate those numbers to world population, then the wars of the 20th century stand out, in the case of the Second World War, by almost an order of magnitude in relation to the rest. If you simply calculate all the dead attributable to the Second World War, including civilians, who in fact accounted for a larger share of deaths than military personnel, you come to the conclusion that somewhere in the region of 2 to 3% of every human being living in 1939 died as a result of World War II. It's even been calculated by one statistician that for the 20th century as a whole, 1 in 22 deaths was a violent death. No previous century, certainly not the 19th, not even the 17th, renowned for the terrors of the 30 Years' War, comes remotely close. And that seems to me to be a very, very hard paradox to resolve. Why was there so much violence at the same time as so much progress? Everybody in this room already has an answer to this question. One of the great things about history is that it's not like nuclear physics. Everybody can do it, and that's why it's such fun. But not all the answers that I hear whenever I raise this question at dinner parties, and I'm a great one for wrecking dinner parties by asking this kind of question, not all the answers quite work. One obvious answer, there isn't time to go through them all at great length, certainly the most popular answer, on the basis of my own experience, is that it has to do with the lethal nature of weaponry. And at least half the people in this room will be thinking to themselves, you can explain this purely in technological terms, because Americans love to explain things in technological terms, and it's tempting. Increased firepower, atomic bombs, that has to be the answer. The trouble is it doesn't work. Because when you specifically ask where extreme violence happened and when extreme violence happened in the 20th century, the striking thing is how much of the violent death was not caused by sophisticated weaponry at all. It was actually, in some cases, caused by the most primitive weapons available. Think of Pol Pot's Cambodia, one of the lethal killing fields of the Cold War era, a place in which millions of people died. But the weaponry available to the regime of the Khmer Rouge was appallingly primitive. Much of the violence was perpetrated with clubs, sticks. And in that sense, the technological explanation doesn't work. It doesn't work in chronological terms either, because of course firepower by the 1990s was far more devastating than it had been, say, in the 1910s or the 1930s. And yet actually the 1990s was one of the most peaceful decades of the time. In the introduction to the book, I try to knock down these obvious explanations. It's not just about density of population. It's not just about economic crises. It can't be explained, as the Marxists used to do, in terms of class conflict. Nor, and this is an important point, nor does it work to argue that extreme ideologies were to blame. This is a very popular idea, and I expect a substantial number of you would probably subscribe to it. The problem is that extreme ideologies, whether you take fascism, a kind of extreme nationalism, or socialism or communism, quite will work as an explanation for extreme violence. For one very good reason. These ideologies were already in existence before the 20th century dawned. All, for example, the key theories that underpinned Adolf Hitler's racialism existed by the last quarter of the 19th century. The great malevolent innovations in racial theory antedated the Third Reich by at least 2 generations. Socialism was well established long before Lenin and Stalin began their reigns of terror. None of the theories that I've listed here, and incidentally, they were the theories I was taught as a schoolboy and as an undergraduate at Oxford, none of these theories will quite do it. And the reason that they won't do it is that not one of them will explain the location and the timing of extreme violence. Because you see, it wasn't evenly distributed. It made a huge difference to a human being in the 20th century if he was born in Glasgow in 1964, as I was, or in Czernowitz in 1904, as some much less luckier men of an earlier generation were. What I want to try and do this evening is to offer a four-part answer to the question that I've now honed. Why, in certain places, at certain times, did violence spike in ways that really today still seem mind-boggling? What is it that causes the death toll to soar into the million-plus range? That's really the hard question. And it seems to me that if we can get that right as historians, we might just stand a chance of avoiding a repeat screening of this particular movie in the 21st century. Let me just refine my point in terms of geography. We all think of the Second World War, whether we're British or American, as an event of world-shaking importance, an event that caused immense tragedy to our societies. And yet when you look at these figures in the chart I'm showing you here, mobilization and mortality rates, that is in relation to the population, and take it country by country for all the combatants of the war, the thing that really leaps out is how incredibly unevenly distributed the violence of World War II was. It's a difficult thing to admit if you're an English speaker, but Britain and the United States scarcely suffered in World War II. By comparison with Poland, the Soviet Union, and I should divide that up because the principal suffering was inflicted on the Russian and Ukrainian people in this period and affected other peoples of the Soviet Union significantly less. Yugoslavia, Germany and Austria, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, these countries bore far larger burdens in terms of mortality and indeed in terms of military service than the English-speaking countries. You can see that mobilization was quite substantial in the United States as it was in Britain, but the mortality rates, that's the crimson bar, were really very small indeed. The countries that I've listed that had mortality rates in excess of, let's say, 10% of the pre-war population killed, had certain things in common. In particular, they had geography in common. What I'd like to suggest, it's a central argument of the book, is that there was a fatal triangle of territory where you were much more likely to suffer a violent death in the 20th century than in the rest of the world. And that triangle was formed by the Baltic, the Balkans, and the Black Sea. It was Eastern, Central, and Eastern Europe that was, for most of the 20th century, certainly its first half, the most dangerous place in the world. There was another pretty dangerous place in Asia, and that was Korea and Manchuria. But the mortality rates weren't quite so high. It's interesting to find that the Asian War, although it claimed many lives, was not as lethal as the European War between 1939 and 1945. So my question is really in some measure a question about this part of the world. And this map here is a little clue as to how I'm going to answer it. Because it's not a regular map. It's not a map of political boundaries. It's a map of ethnic, linguistic boundaries. It's actually a map that was drawn up after the First World War to try to identify the ethnic geography of Central and Eastern Europe. And what you can see when you look at this ethnic map is that Central and Eastern Europe stands out for its patchwork quality, for its heterogeneity. More than most parts of the world, this was, at the beginning of the 20th century, an extraordinarily ethnically mixed region. Let me try to tell you why I think that matters. the answer I'm going to give to this question comes in 4 parts, as I already warned you. Now, that may make you feel a little nervous, but don't worry, all 4 begin with E. And this means that tomorrow morning you will be able to remember at least some of what I've told you, and I hope the most essential points. So of these 4 explanations, this is the first: ethnic disintegration. What I want to suggest, and I use the phrase disintegration very carefully, is that the worst violence of the 20th century happened, by and large, in regions of mixed ethnic settlement. And what happened was a kind of sudden, very violent breakdown of what had previously been relatively stable multi-ethnic societies. And this is the really hard thing to explain. It wasn't as if the violence was somehow a perpetual feature of these societies. On the contrary, ethnically mixed Bohemia, ethnically mixed Galicia, and so on, these were not unstable, violent places. Indeed, there was evidence from around the 1890s into the 1920s that integration and assimilation of different ethnic groups was accelerating. It was possible to look around some parts of Central and Eastern Europe in the 1920s and feel that a kind of multiculturalism was taking shape. What happened was that these processes of assimilation and integration reversed themselves with astonishing and sudden violence. Let me give you a brief illustration of what I mean. The aim, incidentally, for those of you who tend to look at your watches, is that I should shut up by 10:02. I'll shoot for 1:45, and then we'll do some Q&A. So that's when this is going to stop. But what I'm going to do is vary the pace at which I speak and occasionally tell jokes in order to hold your attention. So this is a kind of very simplified representation of the problem. There were, after the First World War, a whole bunch of new nation states created on the basis of what the American President Woodrow Wilson had called the principle of self-determination, that each people should have its own nation state. It sounded great. The trouble was, for the reason I hinted at earlier, the map of Central and Eastern Europe made that impossible. It was too much of a patchwork to get the nations and the states to match up. So you ended up with situations in which, in the case of Czechoslovakia, the majority population accounted for less than 70% of the total population. And in fact, since that lumps together Czechs and Slovaks, the true number was probably lower than that. So you have states created with very large ethnic minorities. Poland is another one in which 30% of the population classifies itself as not Polish. Now, I mentioned earlier the problem that deceptively integration in this multi-ethnic world appeared to be accelerating. And this is perhaps the most interesting and innovative part of the whole project. What I try and show is that in the period from around 1900 to the 1930s, it seemed as if ethnic barriers were diminishing, were coming down. And one of the best indicators of that, it's only one of them though, is the extent to which marriages across ethnic or religious boundaries were increasing. These figures here give you mixed marriages as a percentage of all marriages involving 1 or 2 Jewish partners. So the whole population of marriages involving at least 1 Jewish partner. And what you see is that by the 1920s, most of these figures are from the mid-1920s, some cities in particular had astonishingly high rates of mixed marriage. And among them were Berlin, Hamburg, Posen, Leningrad, Budapest, Breslau, and Vienna. The majority of the cities in that list that I've just read out are, of course, German cities. One of the great paradoxes of the mid-20th century is that the country that would ultimately produce the worst of all racial violence in the 20th century saw the highest levels of integration as measured by intermarriage of any country in the world in the 1920s, in the decade immediately before the National Socialists came to power. What does this tell us? It tells us that processes of ethnic integration are not necessarily linear and stable. they can appear to be proceeding very well and then can quite suddenly and violently reverse themselves. And that is an extremely important insight. That tells us about location. It doesn't tell us exactly all that we need, though. After all, there were many multi-ethnic societies, and of course, in many ways, the United States was one, that did not descend into an abyss of ethnic conflict in the 1940s. So that's only a quarter of the answer that I've given you so far. You need more, you need to know more in order to explain the timing and the precise location of the kind of conflict, the global civil war I'm talking about. So the second E, we've had ethnic disintegration. Now we've got economic volatility. Now, economic volatility is an extremely important measure if you're interested in finance. There are bound to be some people in this room who think a lot about volatility. Volatility is in many ways one of the most important measures in the financial world today. It's simply a measure of variance. It's a measure of how much prices change or growth changes or whatever measure you want to take. The stock market changes over time. And what I want to suggest to you is that it was when volatility was high, when growth or prices or stock prices were fluctuating really widely, that social conflict was most likely to happen. And you can illustrate that quite easily. So this chart tells you about volatility using the measure of standard deviations for just two key indicators, inflation and growth. And you divide the 20th century into sub-periods. And it leaps out that the most volatile period of the 20th century in terms of both inflation and growth was between 1919 and 1939. The interwar period was overwhelmingly more volatile than any period before or since, because inflation and growth leapt around wildly. It was a time of boom and bust. Those of you who are old enough to recollect, or in my case, can recollect the memories of those who lived through it, will understand precisely what I mean. The young undergraduates here will struggle because the young have lived through a time of unprecedentedly low volatility, as I was explaining to some undergraduates this very afternoon. Look at 1990 to 2004, unprecedentedly low volatility in terms of growth and inflation. We've gotten terribly used to 4% or so growth. We've gotten terribly used to 3% or so inflation. That's new. Most of modern economic history is much more of a roller coaster. There's a volatility measure for the US stock market. At least some of you will have an interest in that. Well, no prizes for guessing which decade was the most volatile in history, at least in 20th century history. It's the 1930s. Nothing since, not even the nasty shockers we had in the 1970s and 1980s and 1987, for example, comes anywhere close to what happened between 29 and 37. So that gives us a clue about timing. I don't think it's any coincidence that the worst violence of the 20th century happened right in the middle of it. That it was really in the 1930s and 1940s that violence spiked spectacularly in my fatal geographical triangle. The reason, I think, is intuitive. It's when growth fluctuates from boom to bust that multi-ethnic societies are most likely to come under stress and strain. What characteristically happened, to take just the obvious example of the Jews in Central Europe, was that they did relatively well in the good times, but were then targeted for retribution by the ethnic majority in the bad times. That's a highly stylized account of what happened, but it works pretty well when you get into the detail. Sticking with Prussian efficiency to my timetable, here is my third explanation, which also begins with E. Empires in decline. This is my favorite. It's when empires decline, and this may strike you as slightly paradoxical, it's when they fall apart that violence tends to escalate. Not when they're at their zenith, not even when they're being forged. It's in their death throes that things get really nasty. And that matters hugely because the world in 1900 was so much a world of empires. We forget this. But in 1913, something like 65%, two-thirds of the world's entire land surface, and 82% of its population lived in empires. It wasn't a world of nation-states. It was a world of empires. And in many ways, the peculiar tragedy of the 20th century is that it had many more empires decline and fall during it than any previous century. I estimate that in all, 12 distinct empires declined and fell in the course of the 20th century. And what I want to suggest to you is that that is one very good reason why there was so much violence in the 20th century. Here's a view of the world, once again graphically represented, in terms of empire. And it illustrates the point I've just made. 82% of the world living in empires, of which a very large proportion were European empires. And specifically, a very large proportion of them were West European empires. In the course of the 20th century, virtually all these empires fall apart. It begins, interestingly, with the Asian empires, with the breakup of the Qing Empire in China, but it carries on with the Romanov, Habsburg, Ottoman empires falling apart at the end of the First World War, and continuing with the great crisis of the European empires in Asia when the Japanese launched their great offensives in 1942. One of the interesting things about modern empires is that they don't last very long. Empires declined, but the new empires that came along to replace them turned out to have a much shorter duration than empires traditionally had. And what I've done here is I've calculated the duration of early modern and modern empires. It's a fairly crude calculation, but it's quite revealing. You find that the Ottoman, Habsburg, British, Romanov empires, the empires that had been established in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, endured on average for between 300 and 450 years. But the modern empires, the empires of the 20th century, and I do include the United States in that because it began to acquire an overseas empire only in 1898. Those empires had, or seemed to have, remarkably short durations. The empire of the Bolsheviks, well, to all intents and purposes, the Soviet Union came into existence in 1922. That was when it was formally proclaimed. By 1991, it had ceased to exist. The Japanese Empire, well, it really began in 1895. It was dead and buried by 1944. And the shortest-lived empire of them all was the one that was supposed to last 1,000 years, Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. The Nazis only got beyond their own borders in 1938. By 1944, they were back within them. Now, this is important if I'm right that it's when empires decline that violence spikes, because it means that an enormous amount of imperial decline was crammed into the 20th century. And it works pretty well. The spike, the peak of violence in India in the 20th century occurred in 1947, at the very moment when British rule ended and Hindus and Muslims could wage war on one another without an imperial arbiter to stop them. The Nazi Empire, in its short duration, achieved much more death and destruction in its final 12 months than in any of the previous years of its existence. That's something that's often forgotten. But the Holocaust reached its terrifying zenith during the death throes of Adolf Hitler's empire. This kind of makes sense. It's when imperial authority crumbles that local groups have an incentive to fight one another for future power. It's also when desperate measures tend to be taken by the crumbling imperial authority. So I think there's a reasonably good argument to be made that it's the end of empires that causes violence to spike. I have one more E for you. One of the arguments I make in the book is that we should not understand the 20th century in terms of the triumph of the West, much less, to use Henry Luce's famous phrase, as the American century. We should really think of it in quite the opposite terms. We should think of it in terms of the Great Reconvergence of East and West, perhaps even of the resurgence of the East, of a revival of the East that dates back to 1904, the moment when Japan inflicted a military defeat on the Russian Empire and showed what had largely come to be forgotten, that Asians were capable of defeating Europeans in military conflict. Let me elucidate a little further. The descent of the West is part of the subtitle of my book, and it's a phrase I'm sure that will get me into trouble because it reminds people, I suppose, of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, or Twilight of the Occident, if you prefer. A work written after the First World War in a spirit of sort of Nietzschean German cultural pessimism. My argument isn't like that. It's really a very practical one. The amazing thing about the world in 1900 or 1913 was that it was totally dominated by the West. Totally dominated by the West. The Western empires had subjugated Asia almost entirely. And yet they accounted for a remarkably small percentage of the world's population. In 1913, more than half of the world's population lived in Asia, and less than 20% could be defined as living in the West. And yet those Western societies ruled. My history of the 20th century is a history of the unraveling of that dominance, beginning, as I've said, in 1904 and continuing through a series of crises, some of them crises of extraordinary violence, of which I think the Japanese bid for greater East Asian co-prosperity stands out. That is the real story that we should try to understand. And what I want to suggest to you is that that rebalancing of the world, which brought from subjugation the peoples of Asia back into a position of something like parity with the West, was an extremely painful process. It was not a smooth transition. The loss of Western hegemony in Asia was largely a loss by violence. Somebody set their watch to tell me to shut up. But I have got 5 more minutes, according to my highly reliable replica US World War II watch. This is another way of thinking of the problem. If you look at the ratio of European to East Asian per capita GDP, you could also do this for American to East Asian. As recently as the 1960s, it was astonishingly high. The average European was 60 times, more than 60 times, better off than the average East Asian, as recently as 1968. That gap has closed steadily since then. If you calculate it in constant $2,000, we're down to a discrepancy of 20 to 1 if you use purchasing power parity, which is just a way of accounting for the fact that a haircut is more expensive in London than it is in Shanghai. Then you find that the discrepancy is less than 10 to 1 now. That is the Great Reconvergence we're living through. And I want to suggest to you that in political as well as economic terms, it is in many ways the most important geopolitical story of the 20th century. Let me draw my thoughts to a conclusion. And the conclusion has profound implications for the present. I hope I'll have a chance to talk about that in the question and answer session. Point number 1, to recap. Ethnic integration, processes of assimilation of ethnic minorities, these are reversible. They are not necessarily stable processes, and indeed the faster these processes occur, the more violently the backlash can happen. Under certain circumstances, and this is the critical point to remember, these 4 points can't be taken in isolation. They're part, if you like, of an equation. If you take a multi-ethnic society, even one where rates of intermarriage are up to 1 in 2, and subject it to a lot of economic volatility, stand well back. That is when trouble is likely to occur. Then locate that society in the periphery of an empire. Put it somewhere where imperial authority is crumbling. Stand even further back. She's going to blow. And then locate this society somewhere on the continuum of Western decline. Well, you need to get into the shelter at this point and lock the door. What does this tell us for the present? It tells us that there is already one part of the world which has all 4 of my lethal ingredients in place and in abundance. It has ethnic disintegration. religious minorities and majorities are already engaged in violence against one another, and not just across the great divisions of civilization that Samuel Huntington famously identified in 1993. Within one of these civilizations, ethnic conflict is raging in the region I'm talking about. It is a region which is subjected to astonishing economic volatility. Some parts are prosperous in ways that make the jaw drop, other parts wretchedly poor. Growth surges up and down in ways that we haven't experienced in this part of the world since the 1970s. It's a place where an imperial authority that was once dominant is manifestly in decline, can no longer maintain its authority, whether by military means or economic means. And it is a place where the whole question of Western hegemony is in many ways the dominant political issue of the day. I'm talking, of course, not about Europe, but about the Middle East. The most troubling thing in the world today, the thing that preoccupies me most, is that all the things I've identified as having caused the great cataclysm of the mid-20th century in Central and Eastern Europe are happening before our very eyes in the Middle East today. Sunnis slaughtering Shiites, Arabs waging war on Jews, an economics of oil rent seeking and grinding poverty coexisting side by side. And above all, perhaps this is my most controversial argument, a part of the world where a once powerful hegemon, if you prefer that word to empire, namely the United States, can no longer credibly call the shots. If the decline of the West is going to produce anything really ugly in the foreseeable future, I believe it will produce that in the Middle East. Well, it might seem a very somber note on which to conclude what sounds like a prediction of another war of the world in our time. But I suppose we should take heart from the existence and astonishing success of a place like Vanderbilt. After all, isn't the lesson of Southern history that ethnic and racial conflict aren't inevitable, and that with prosperity and political stability, take away the volatility, take away the crises of political or imperial authority, it's possible for a diverse society to live in peace and harmony. Ladies and gentlemen, we can only hope that one day we can say the same things about the Middle East. Thank you very much. Well, in a weak moment, I said I would answer questions. Now that I can see how many people are here, I'm regretting it. I don't know whether we have roving mics or whether you can make yourself heard. The auditorium has wonderful acoustics. Gentleman in the blue shirt, please. I'd be very glad to. I spent some time in Bosnia when I was researching the book, and there's quite a section on what happened there. Indeed, it recurs throughout the book because in many ways Bosnia is a place that more than anywhere perhaps exemplifies the problem, a multi-ethnic society, which can be quite peaceful for long periods of history. And yet when it comes under what might be called external stress, can explode. I went to Visegrad. Visegrad is a beautiful town with a wonderful bridge built in the time of the Ottoman Empire across the River Drina. There's even a wonderful novel about it that one day you should read if you haven't, by a chap named Ivo Andrić, called The Bridge on the Drina. It's a wonderful book. And it describes this phenomenon I'm talking about. In many ways, it inspired me as I was working. It shows a multi-ethnic society of Muslims, of Serbs, of Croats, and others, Jews, living quite peacefully together, and yet periodically in their history experiencing external shocks and then internal convulsions. And as you rightly pointed out, sir, as recently as the 1990s, this place exploded into terrible violence. In Visegrad, a gang of local Serbs, Bosnian Serbs, carried out horrific violence against their neighbors, who just happened to be Muslims, beheading people they must have known personally and throwing them off the bridge into the river below. And you go there today and you just can't believe it happened, because it's, in so many ways, a normal Central European town. I think this is one of the, if you like, the microcosms of the story I'm describing. It illustrates how, under certain circumstances, multi-ethnic societies can turn on one another in ways that seem quite bizarre. It wasn't just hideous violence of the sort I've just described, it was also sexual violence. This same gang that effectively had a reign of terror in Visegrad for several weeks were taking local Muslim girls to a nearby fitness center, it's quite bizarre, and systematically raping them with a view to impregnating them with little Serbs. You can't believe this kind of thing could happen because it sounds like something out of World War II. It sounds remarkably like the things that were done in precisely that part of the world in the early 1940s. After all, what happened in Bosnia during the Second World War was really just that the Nazis sponsored a civil war. They didn't have to do an awful lot to keep the killing going once it had begun. Now, the good news is that it's hard to imagine all of that starting again. But why is that? Well, one reason is that Bosnia, like Kosovo, has become a kind of welfare state run by the international community. It's in a remarkably depressing economic condition, and anybody with any drive gets out. What you're left with is a sort of basket case. And what I worry about is that if it's left in that condition and finally the international drip feed is turned off, then it could all start over. I don't believe that problem has been solved. I think it's just been put on hold. Yes, sir. No, I don't think it is necessarily a happy event. What I'm really talking about is a situation in which cultures that have been integrated not only in terms, say, of intermarriage, but also in terms of education and residence, societies in which people of different faiths or of different ethnic backgrounds live side by side, literally, fall apart and revert to segregation, to use a word that, of course, has a general applicability and not only a specifically southern connotation. Visegrad is now a purely Serb town. Nobody lives there except Serbs. 10 years ago, it was a truly multicultural, multi-ethnic town. Now, one doesn't need to have a view about the superiority of one system or the other to realize that getting from a multi-ethnic to a segregated society is a horrible process. And it's that process that interests me. When I talk about disintegration, I specifically want you to imagine a process whereby a harmoniously coexisting multicultural society tears itself apart, where people use violence to impose segregation on their neighbors. It's happening at the moment in Iraq. I've talked to people who've been there recently, and they say the problem in Baghdad and the surrounding provinces is that increasingly there is not really an insurgency against US and UK forces going on. They're kind of irrelevant. What is going on is a tit-for-tat feud between Sunnis and Shiites. And what happens is that periodically, one side or the other slaughters 25 or 30 people in broad daylight to encourage the others to get out of that part of town. So it's disintegration that I'm interested in. And what fascinates me is the extent to which this pattern whereby apparently stable societies tear one another apart crops up in all sorts of different locations that I haven't had time to talk about. For example, it's something that you find in Guatemala. It's something that you find in certain parts of Central Africa, particularly Rwanda. The civil wars that characterized those places as recently as the 1980s and 1990s, although they involved a measure of outside sponsorship, were on close inspection in many ways ethnic conflicts. And in some ways, they took what had been relatively stable relationships and tore them to pieces. Hutus and Tutsis were not segregated in Rwanda before the Civil War. There was, in fact, quite a high level of intermarriage. But the violence that flared up suddenly made those sorts of relationships taboo. It's a nightmarish thing, and I think increasingly hard for Americans to imagine. In common with Western Europe, this society has become much more integrated and much less segregated than it used to be. And it's quite interesting when you look at intermarriage statistics for the United States, how recent that change is. And what I suppose I'm arguing is that we shouldn't assume it's a stable non-linear process, or rather a stable linear process. On the contrary, history suggests that that kind of integration can reverse itself quite violently under certain circumstances. And by the way, I do also do short answers. There's a lady towards the back in a red top that I can just make out. Yes, you, madam. Yes, I can certainly try and do that. The interesting thing about Cambodia, and this applies to a great deal of what happened in the Cold War, incidentally, and indeed what happened inside the Soviet Union, is that what was done in the name of a variation of Marxism or Leninism or Maoism, what was done in terms of class, often when you look at it closely, turns out to have been as much, if not more, about ethnicity. For example, in the case of Cambodia, one of Pol Pot's objectives was to create a pure Khmer society. That was the whole idea behind Kampuchea. And so it was minorities, non-Cambodian minorities within Cambodia who were subjected to disproportionate violence. That included, for example, the Vietnamese living within the borders of the Khmer Rouge regime. So there's some quite good evidence to show that although formally this was a kind of extreme Marxist regime engaged in trying to obliterate capitalism, it was also, at some level, a kind of racial or ethnic project. Northern Ireland's an illustration of something slightly different, and that is the extent to which a society which is in many, many respects outwardly homogeneous. You couldn't really tell Catholic from Protestant if you stripped them all naked. Actually, you could scarcely tell them apart dressed. Is nevertheless capable of tearing itself apart and institutionalizing sectarian or ethnic difference. And it's important that it's come up because I want to stress here the difference between race and ethnicity. There's an enormous and complex literature about what we mean by race. Are there any really meaningful biological differences other than skin color or hair type or eye shape when we talk about race? I am only interested in that because people were interested in it. Not just interested in it, but obsessed by it. One of the arguments I make in the book is that the idea that race matters is the most poisonous, toxic idea of the 20th century. It's devised in the 19th century, but it's put into practice in the 20th century. And it's not just put into practice by Hitler, it's put into practice right across the board in all kinds of extraordinary ways. What really matters, though, in practice is ethnicity. That's to say, the cultures we construct for ourselves. It's a cultural phenomenon. It includes religion, but it extends beyond that. Our ethnic group is, in a sense, is what our parents and grandparents and the people around us make us. It's the songs we sing, the language that we speak, perhaps the way that we dress, perhaps the way that we cook. All of those things taken together, the ethnic differences that make the world, after all, an interesting place, make it all diverse. Those are the things that very often people use as the basis for violence, or sometimes use to interpret racial difference. Go from saying you're a Catholic to saying you're biologically inferior to me. And Northern Ireland illustrates how absurd it all is. How bizarre when you go to, as I have, to a place like Derry or Londonderry as it used to be known. How bizarre it is that these two communities can hate one another so passionately when to any outside observer, they're identical. apart from forms of worship, they are fundamentally the same people. And one last point on that subject. I went to a mass grave in Bosnia. They were exhuming people who had been killed during the Civil War to try to identify them individually using DNA samples. And somebody told me an interesting thing. They said, we can use DNA testing to find out who somebody was as an individual. But the DNA testing won't tell us if that person was a Bosnian Muslim or a Serb or a Croat, because genetically they're indistinguishable. And the same is true in Northern Ireland. There has been over the centuries enough, by far enough, intermarriage for there to be no significant detectable DNA difference between these communities. I will do a short answer eventually, I feel sure. It's only a matter of time. Now, I've got to make sure that I'm not in any way biased against a part of the whole. So it's surprisingly bright, this light, which is why I'm not wearing. I should wear sunglasses, actually, shouldn't I? There's a cluster of our arms up there in that corner, and I'm going to show how extraordinarily politically correct I am by asking the lady there to ask the next question. We're going for gender balance here, something we've learnt about at Harvard the hard way. Yes. Well, we were due a long question after all these long answers. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, let me try and take the 2 points that you've made one by one. Firstly, of course, not. I certainly don't think that the answer is some kind of return to segregation or the balkanization of the world. Quite the contrary. The point I'm making is not that, that the integration of multi-ethnic societies leads necessarily to violence. Not at all. What I'm saying is that it can backfire under certain circumstances, and we must be very careful not to allow those circumstances to occur. That's why it matters to get economic policy right. You don't want to take a multi-ethnic society and then plunge it into a Great Depression. That's why it terribly matters that there should be political and institutional stability, and that whether it's the Balkans or the Middle East, there should not be a question of who is the imperial hegemon at issue between two ethnic groups. So rather, my argument is about vigilance. It's about recognizing that the experiment with a multi-ethnic society is not necessarily a stable one, and that one must be extremely cautious in the way in which one goes about it. The second point I can answer with very briefly. I mean, book deals at length with what happened in Yugoslavia throughout the 20th century, not only in the 1990s, and looks closely at the way in which, for example, the Croatian regime with its Nazi backers engaged in systematic genocidal policy against Serbs. So nobody can accuse me of being unfair and unbalanced on that issue. My great fear is, in fact, that the same experiment is about to be tried in Iraq, and that the pseudo-solution of partition, which I've already heard suggested seriously by eminent American commentators, from Leslie Gelb of the Council on Foreign Relations downwards, is about to be brought forward as the cure for the problems of Iraq, and that would be disastrous. Because once you start talking about partition in multi-ethnic societies, you are talking about expulsion, ethnic cleansing, and of course the creation of miniature states that are highly unlikely to be sustainable without external support. That is not the way to go, and I think Yugoslavia has made it very, very clear. It's hard to resist, though. Self-determination is a very attractive theory. It would make the world so neat if only everybody had his own nation state. But that would be an awful lot of nation states. So I think, on the contrary, the real argument of my book is it's about how to make multi-ethnic societies stable. It's about how to prevent the world balkanizing itself, and in particular about how to avoid the Middle East becoming the Central and Eastern Europe of the 21st century. Now, I'm never sure when to stop. But when people start to leave and the Chancellor stands up, it's generally time to stop. Time's up. Thank you. Thanks very much.